In honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I thought we would talk about a critically important moment in the Reverend's life that speaks to the right to keep and bear arms in a huge way. In fact, a way that persuaded, in my view, the United States Supreme Court to rule in our favor in NYSERPA versus Bruin. Stay tuned. I'll tell you the story when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and New York Times bestselling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so. We really would appreciate the support. All right, so today we're honoring Martin Luther King Day, it's certainly a worthwhile effort to honor Martin Luther King Jr. He was a great American patriot. He fought hard for civil rights, and I thought I'd put a little bit of his efforts into context. Because remember, what Martin Luther King stood for was that we all should be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin. So basically what he wanted was for the purposes and the goals of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were enacted after the Civil War, including the 14th Amendment, which comes up quite a bit in the context of Second Amendment litigation. Focusing on the 14th Amendment, Martin Luther King, of course, in the 20th century, argued that separate but equal and other government policies were discriminating against blacks, against African Americans on the basis of race, and those government policies needed to be changed because the goal of the 14th Amendment had not been satisfied. And the great example of this, in my view, that often gets ignored by historians, and you'll see why in a second, is the fact that Martin Luther King was denied a pistol permit in the 1950s by the state of Alabama. So to put this into context, I printed out an article here from the History Channel. It talks about how on January 30th, 1956, an unidentified suspected white supremacist terrorist, bombed the Montgomery home of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And then it goes on to say in this History Channel article that when Martin Luther King was speaking in a nearby church on the evening of January 30th, a man pulled up in a car, walked into King's home, and tossed an explosive onto the porch, and the bomb went off, damaging the house, but no one was hurt, thank God. Let me tell you what that article does not mention, which I think is mission critical. What did Martin Luther King do? What did Dr. Martin Luther King do after his home was bombed in January of 1956? Well, it turns out that he did not sit on his hands. No, he went out and tried to acquire a pistol permit so he could carry handguns or firearms with him wherever he went because he feared for his life. In other words, his solution to being attacked and threatened was to get a gun. That was not mentioned in this History Channel article that I'll put a link to. Let me turn to an amicus brief submitted in NYSERPA versus Bruin by an organization, a prominent organization, called the National African American Gun Owners Association. In this brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, they talk about the exact bombing in 1956 that the History Channel talks about. But let me tell you what else this brief points out, the additional history that this History Channel this article apparently omitted for some reason. It talks about that in January of 1956, King's house was bombed. And it turns out that armed black men, this is not me, this is what the brief says, quote, armed black men scrambled to protect him, Coretta, and their young daughter, close quote. That brief cites to a prominent professor at Fordham University in New York City, Nicholas Johnson. Nicholas Johnson wrote a well-received historical book on guns in America, specifically the black experience with firearms. Professor Johnson's book was entitled, if you want to check it out, Negroes and the Gun, the Black Tradition of Arms. Professor Johnson, Fordham University. So he is cited, Professor Johnson is cited in this amicus brief, telling the story. Now this is what Professor Johnson goes on to write about that experience with concealed carry permitting regimes that Martin Luther King found unfortunately, he was not able to get one. Here's what Professor Johnson writes, as quoted in this brief. Quote, King even sought a permit to carry a concealed gun in his car, but local authorities determined that he had not shown, quote unquote, good cause for needing a permit to carry a firearm. A generation later, protests against the caprice and cronyism that pervaded these types of discriminatory permitting systems would spark a movement toward non-discretionary, shall issue concealed carry permits that would become the American norm. Close quote. That's Professor Johnson talking about Martin Luther King. In fact, it turns out that the denial of the pistol permit to the Dr. Martin Luther King was actually reported in the Montgomery, Alabama newspaper at that time. This is what the Montgomery Advertiser reported when Dr. King was turned down for his permit. This is the article being quoted, also in the Nysurpa versus Bruin brief by the National African American Gun Owners Association brief. Quote, a Negro boycott leader whose home was bombed earlier this week has been denied a pistol permit, the sheriff's department said yesterday. The Reverend M.L. King and two other Negro clergymen requested the permit Wednesday, Sheriff Maxim Butler said. Sheriff Butler said he declined to issue a pistol permit, which King said he wanted for a night watchman at his home. He said threats against him have been received continuously, and he felt the need for a watchman. So that is the lesson that I want you to take away this Martin Luther King Day, which is a lot of great things will be said about the Dr. King, and that's wonderful, but never forget that when Dr. King's home was bombed in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956, his response was to go out and procure firearms and to try to have concealed carry permits for him and apparently for his colleagues there. And remember, the response to the bombing of his home in 1956 was that armed men showed up to protect his family. Again, guns in the hands of good people, guns in the hands of the law-abiding, protect innocent lives against the violent thugs, psychopaths, evildoers, terrorists, and other forms of tyranny that threaten human freedom and human life. Okay, hope you do something enjoyable in honor of Martin Luther King today, and hope you learned a little bit something here at the Four Boxes Diner about the denial of his pistol permit and why, of course, we now know that would not be allowed under Nysurpa versus Bruin, which has done away with these may issue permitting regimes, these discretionary regimes, and that's great news. So again, if you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner, please do so, and we'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.